when you're talking about whether or not we should use markets or not, you're really just deciding, well, scarcity is going to exist in any system. Scarcity doesn't go away. The question is what are the consequences of scarcity and who bears them?
This is A New Angle, and I'm your host, Justin Angle, marketing professor at the University of Montana. This podcast is my chance to speak with cool people doing awesome things in and around the great state of Montana. We are proudly underwritten by First Security Bank and Blackfoot. Okay, so we're back with Bryce Ward. You came back again. We're keeping this going.
The third time is the charm. Hopefully
third time is the charm.
We really deliver something.
And now we have big news. We're going to break news right here. We have a name for the series. As promised, it is Incentives and Instincts. Bryce, how do you feel about that name?
I like it.
Yeah.
We have a logo, too. It's very fancy.
We have a logo. Yep. Super fancy. We do things right here at A New Angle / Incentives and Instincts. That's the sub-branding thing. We got to work on the brand family, but we have a name. So Agreed. Anyway, this is timely. So when we dropped our last episode, which was sort of our reflection on the future of work and what we learned from Scott Latham and Michael Punk and others, ironically, a study by the St. Louis Fed came out the day we released our episode, suggesting that the paybacks or the returns to higher education might not be as high as what we presented in our conversation and what research has shown historically. Bryce, you want to comment on that study and the article in The Atlantic? And because we got some listener comments about that.
So let's be very specific. So
yes.
What it shows is that the wealth premium has dropped. The income premium is still there. The issue is that particularly if you were born after 1980, if you are a college graduate at this age, which is still pretty young, they aren't accumulating wealth at the same rate as people who were, say, 30s in previous generations, previous cohorts.
Right, so that distinction is important. They are making the same income premium, but the wealth...
Slightly less, but it's still large. It's like 50%.
Sure, it's close to the same, but the wealth they are accumulating is not the same. And that adjusts for just time, right? It's not just comparing younger people to older people.
No, this is... We're fixing your age.
Sure.
And we're saying... And essentially, there's a initial break that occurs with people born after 1960. So basically, boomers versus X's and millennials. Because X's have also done more poorly relative to the past.
Right.
Just overall, setting aside the college premium, just overall, the Great Recession was very bad for X's and millennials. Now, this data that we're talking about, it's also worth pointing out, it's 3 years old.
Sure.
Right. So the Survey of Consumer Finances comes out every 3 years. So we'll get the new data this year. So we'll be very interested to see what the 2019 data says.
Okay.
But the 2016 data showed that people born after 1980 were not catching. So the Gen Xers had started to kind of come back to where they were supposed to be by 2016. In 2010, everybody was in a mess. But by 2016... X's had started, if you were born in the 70s, you were starting to get back towards, you were still below where you were supposed to be. But it was like a $15,000 gap as opposed to 3 years earlier when it was a $50,000 gap.
Okay.
Millennials had come back a little bit, but it was still a big gap. Right? So that's just the overall median net worth picture. So that's just worth talking about. We're talking about median net worth.
Right.
So then when we move to the college premium, now we're basically trying to compare... Okay, so within a cohort, you have a degree, you don't have a degree. How much more wealth do you have at this particular point in your life? And technically, it's not born after 1980, which is that the cutoff for X and millennial? Is that?
Oh gosh, I don't know.
I think it might be.
I think it's like 84
or something. But anyway, so it's fringe X and millennial.
Yeah.
Is what we're talking about. So for that group, the wealth premium for whites has shrunk. There is still a premium.
Still a premium.
For blacks, zero. There is no wealth premium for African American families with a head of household with a college degree. For people born after 1980.
Right. And there's multiple mechanisms there, but two kind of theories that came to mind that we're sort of going to transition into are asset prices. So it's a little bit more difficult to get into the market, including housing. That's a big part of it. And then the price of education has increased rapidly as well, right?
Yeah. So those are two, and there's a third one.
Okay.
So first, housing prices. So if you look at the ratio of, say, median household income to median home value, or median home value to median household income, that's gone up a bunch, right? And in Montana, it's gone up a ton.
Yeah.
So if you're getting to be the time you're going to go buy your first house, you're buying in at a really high price point.
Yeah.
Right. So it's worth something, but you're taking out a whole bunch of debt. And so your net worth doesn't look very good.
Sure.
College debt, also higher. College is
price
more,
of college
price
and
of,
the debt associated, like those two work together.
Are although interestingly, if you look across age cohorts, amongst people who still have college debt, the median is about the same. It's about $30,000 for a bachelor's degree. $30,000 to $40,000 is kind of median. But that may be that's just a snapshot. So we're not seeing the movie of people paying it back and all that kind of stuff. But so there's that. So that when you're talking about in your 30s, when typical median household net worth is like $50,000,
right?
Carrying $30,000 of debt will eliminate whatever premium you might have. The third story, which I think should apply to everybody, so I'm not sure if it should explain the college premium, is financial liberalization. Right?
Okay, explain that.
Basically, it's a lot easier to borrow money than it used to be.
Okay.
And we don't actually teach you a whole lot of financial literacy. So you get to be 18 and suddenly, oh, hey, people are giving me credit all over the place.
Sure. Even after the financial crisis, it's still easier.
Still easy to get credit.
All these debt vehicles, it's just to create a supply for these debt markets.
And it's easy to make a mistake.
Yes.
Right? And when you make a mistake, it just compounds, right? If you make a mistake and you just keep carrying interest around with you, that's a big burden. It will lower your net worth. So the short version is it's certainly an interesting finding. I think it's probably the first two explanations. The fact that it's very hard to get assets.
Yeah.
And then because it's expensive, you're also not getting the same appreciation, right? Like if you were coming of age in 1990 in Montana,
yep,
right, you could buy a house relatively cheap. And now if you're sitting here 10 years, 15, 20 years later, you got enormous appreciation out of that asset, which that's just padding your net worth. Whereas if you're buying now and housing price appreciation this decade in a lot of markets has been slower, particularly if you're smoothing through the Great Recession.
Right.
So if you came of age and you bought your house in 2007, the total appreciation of your house over that 10-year period, in some markets has been hot.
Right.
But in a lot of markets has been certainly lower than what was happening before. And so, it's harder to accumulate that net worth at a young age. Like I said, I'm very curious. I don't know exactly when the 2019 Survey of Consumer Finances gets released, but it'll be very interesting to see somebody come back and revisit that with an additional 3 years to see if we've gotten ourselves back on track at all, or if we continue to be. I'm sure there's still going to be a lag, right? It's hard to imagine it going away, given that housing prices are still high and college debt remains college debt. But hopefully, as they've aged just a little bit, we'll see some catch up.
So an open question in many ways, and one that we'll be paying attention to. It's squarely in the middle of the sorts of things we're going to be talking about here. And within that, I think this dovetails nicely for our planned topic of conversation today, and that is, material security or insecurity in many ways. And in a lot of ways, that's kind of the upshot from this future work conversation is, are people going to be able to provide for their needs? Are they going to be able to save for their dreams and invest in their families and do all these things? Let's break this down a little bit. I mean, what are we talking about when we're talking about material security? How does an economist kind of conceptualize that?
Well, at the simple version, it's, do I have enough resources to provide me with options?
Okay.
Right? That's it's the easiest way to think about it is you can think of it as kind of the freedom or power to make choices, because I'm not constrained by the fact that the bills come due next month And if I don't do everything I can to make money, I won't be able to pay all those bills, right? That is material insecurity, right? And so, there's components to it. There's the wealth component, right? If I have more stuff in the bank, I've got a cushion.
You've got options.
But there's the flow of income, there's the volatility of income, and then there's consumption. And in terms of, there's, I guess, fixed consumption that you've already kind of committed to, your mortgage or your student loan payment or whatever it is, that you can't really get around that easily. And then there's discretionary spending around that where, I can choose to spend this money or not. But all of that stuff combined, that leaves me in my position of security depending on what my consumption needs are, how much income I have, and how much in the bank I have. And we can define income broadly. It's not just your job. It's also family transfers, government transfers, capital income, all that stuff.
And this kind of all wraps in. I mean, we're in an election year. We're hot in the primary season right now. So, and this notion of the middle class is this contested soundbite. What is it? Who are the middle class? Is it shrinking? Is it growing? How are they doing relative to other classes, et cetera? But there is this kind of broad notion that it feels a little bit harder to get ahead for the people in the middle. And that's sort of qualitative, right? Let's break that down. I mean, you've got things like productivity. You've got things like wages. Are wages growing? What's productivity doing? How do those two relate? Are costs of living increasing? All these sort of dimensions that lead to ultimately feeling if you're materially secure or insecure.
Hold on for that. There's just one more fact I want to kind of throw in there.
I missed something.
I just was thinking about, I defined it conceptually, but I didn't give you any data on how secure we are.
Right. Yeah, what's baseline?
So right now, most people say they're doing okay.
Yeah.
Right? So if you ask...
That's a self-report survey.
Yeah,
you
self-report
ask people.
survey, you can say, okay, thinking about your financial situation, not anything else in your life, just your finances. How are you doing right now? And you basically give people up there and... I'm not getting by, I'm barely getting by, I'm doing okay, or I'm comfortable.
Yeah.
Right? And 3/4 of people say they're doing okay or they're comfortable. And
any self-report bias in that? Like, is there a bias to over-report your standing?
There is on a different measure, right?
Yeah.
But this actually, if we can cross-reference, because in the same survey we have questions about, do you have a rainy day fund? Can you handle a $400 expense? And you basically kind of consistently get, it's kind of 20 to 35% of people who appear to be at or below the margin.
Okay.
Right? And then 2/3 to 75% who are kind of okay-ish. Now, there's demographics with that.
Yep.
Right? So the easiest ones to think about are age and education. Right? So the older you are and the more educated you are, the more secure you are.
Makes sense.
Right? So if you're a low-educated young person, like 75% of them are not secure. So, there's a lot of variation within the population. But, if we look at these measures of, whether you have a rainy day fund or whether you have can handle a $400 expense, whether your income exceeds your expenses, and most you kind of get half, kind of depending on what measures you're looking at. But typically the hardest hit group is 1/4.
And how does that look over time? So are we at a time where people are more or less secure or feeling more or less secure than they have in the past?
So this particular survey started in 2013, so I don't have a really long time series with it.
It's not super old, yeah.
But relative to 2013, things have gotten better.
Okay.
Right? A lot better. So you see the effects of the recession wear off. Because if you go back, in that first question, kind of doing okay or comfortable, it was 63%, and now it's 75%.
Okay.
Right. So there's been material improvement in how people report their kind of subjective preference of it, but also when you give them very specific questions, like if something happened and you needed to cover 3 months of expenses without an income, do you have the funds to cover it without kind of selling things, borrowing stuff, And about half have a rainy day fund or can handle it without borrowing.
And that reality that it's improved since 2013 is it's consistent with, if you look at our capital markets, our housing markets, unemployment at record lows, like it's consistent with this broad area of, there's a lot going right
And wages at the bottom are growing faster than wages elsewhere. Okay. The gap is largely due to minimum wage increases. So you have a bunch of.
That's an important point, by the way. When you hear the talking point that, hey, wealth inequality is not a big deal. Wages at the low end are growing faster than any other, or than they are in the middle. That's skewed a little, not skewed, but we're talking minimum wage jobs, and a lot of that change is because
the
minimum,
delta.
Yes.
So the fact that you see in recent years wage increases for the low end are above the middle and the high.
Mm-hmm.
If you took out state minimum wage increases, that gap entirely disappears.
Sure. So it's driven by policy.
That particular gap is a policy choice.
Okay.
So anyhow, back to what's driving long-term trends in this? And so again, there's the income side and there's the consumption side. So let's start with the income side. I think kind of the broad brush picture of the income side is that adjusted for inflation, wages at the middle of the distribution have been relatively flat. Depends on what exact period you choose to start, whether they've been flat entirely or whether they've gone up.
Uh-huh.
Go back 40 years, they're flat. Go back 30 years, they're up. So there's a little bit of exactly what time horizon are you looking at?
Sure.
And they've gone up a little bit in recent years, so we're slightly growing above inflation, a little tiny bit.
Mm-hmm.
But the bigger question is what just determines wages in general?
Right.
Like, why is it that some people can say, yeah, I'm doing great, right? Or more people in some cohort or in some time period. What is it that causes the fluctuation and how well you're doing, right? And so then we talk about breaking wages into two components, right? So the classical model that you would teach in, first day of a labor economics class is a perfectly competitive market. There's no market power. Wages are just a function of productivity.
Sure.
Right? And prices, as well as the marginal revenue product, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if your productivity goes up, you earn more money. Or if the price of the products of the firm that you work for go up faster than inflation, you should earn more money.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So that's the simple version. And productivity matters.
Yeah.
Right? Even today, we still see lots of evidence that people who work in more productive industries or more productive areas, they earn higher wages. One of the interesting things that's I don't know if it's a change, but if we're just observing it more, but there seems to be more variation within industry across firms.
Yeah, so that's something I want to either put a pin in and come back to, because it kind of equates to some of what we talked about previous episodes with this golden ticket. Like if you get a job at Amazon or Google or Facebook or Apple, you are going to outperform people at other companies. Yeah.
So, and there's two potential sides to that, right? And part of what we're trying to do empirically in the field is kind of crack how much of this is because you're actually more productive working at that firm,
right?
And how much of it is that firm has market power,
mm-hmm.
and that firm is basically sharing some of the rent, we call it, the excess return over what you would get in a competitive market due to the fact that they have power. There's only a handful of them, or whatever it is. They share some with their workers,
mm-hmm.
right? And we used to do this. That was largely what the bargaining with unions was about, right? You had these kind of big three automakers who had a lot of market power, and then the union was the means to which the laborers bargained with the capital to share the rent from that particular outcome. Now, there's other parts to unions, and there's other parts of the story.
So we've got wages, we've got productivity, and we've got the ability to extract rent.
Power, yeah.
Power. And so maybe just define that rent, that ability to extract rent a little bit more explicitly.
Yeah, so we talk about, think of the competitive market as the benchmark, right? In a competitive market, if there's excess return, right? So if somebody is earning more than their marginal product, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if a worker is earning more or the capitalist is earning more, a new firm will enter and compete it away until it drives that rent, we call it, or
right.
economic profit to zero. So to say there's not profit, it's just excess profit above what we would expect in a competitive market.
Mm-hmm.
So if that's not happening, if there is rent, well, now that's another source of potential wages or income for workers.
Sure, all kinds of things it could mean.
So yeah, so if there's rent to share, so so that's the other broadly we have these two components to your earnings. There's the just how productive are you, and there's the how much rent in the system and how is that rent getting shared.
Right.
And a lot of what we talk about now is there's just the debate. Is there a lot of rent in the system? First question. Second question is, how is that rent being shared?
Okay.
Right? And that is still a fight within lots of academic stuff. I think the reality is really hard because it's not like we have one labor market. Mm-hmm. We have a bunch of different labor markets in different places, in different industries, in different firms, and it's very hard to kind of parse it. There are some studies, though, that do suggest that wages are kind of falling below productivity, at least in some places, in some industries, which would suggest market power on the part of the employer.
Right, of the owners.
The owners, yeah.
Okay, so let's we've sort of specced out the components of income and drivers of wealth in these dynamics. How are they sort of operating right now?
Again, it's hard to talk broadly.
Yeah.
Because what's happening in healthcare is different than what's happening in tech, and what's different than what's happening in manufacturing, and in difference with there's kind of very different stories. But in broad brush terms, part of why this links to the future of work, right, is the two biggest trends are globalization, which changes who you compete with.
Right.
Both as a firm and a worker. Mm-hmm. But we certainly have an accumulating body of evidence that when we allowed China into the World Trade Organization, it was a change in the nature of the effects of trade on workers.
Okay.
Which is, I guess, not surprising when you bring 1 billion people into the labor market. At
a comparatively very low cost.
Very low cost.
Yeah.
Because when I was in graduate school, before that happened, I guess that happened while I was in graduate school, but I took trade before it happened. We talked about, trade wasn't really that big of a deal. Mm-hmm. And we called it north-north trade versus north-south trade, right? Which basically was rich countries trading with each other, and the rich countries, their economies looked the same. And so you were kind of competing with somebody who looked like you.
Yeah, it didn't make much difference.
We were basically trading Mercedes for Fords and Toyotas, and it was a particular product mix as opposed to a fundamental change, which is north-south trade, which is a low-income country trading with a high-income country, where, if you're a worker who's exposed to those, your job and your firm can be done by those workers.
Yeah, for a fraction of the cost.
You're going to lose power in the market, right? So if there was market power that you were exploiting, that's gone.
A New Angle is brought to you by First Security Bank and Blackfoot, two cool companies doing awesome things all over Montana.
This is Sam Schultz, and you're listening to A New Angle.
And to the extent that you're not more productive than they are, and you might be, you might not be, depends. If you're not completely more productive, then you're going to lose.
Right.
If you are more productive, there's a chance that you can still survive, but the rent is going to go away. So the cushiness, right? How many benefits you get, how much your wage goes up, all of that stuff, that's not your boss being mean to you. It's the market being mean to you.
Yeah, in many ways, yeah.
It's that we collectively made a choice to trade with these countries and get the benefits of that, which are cheaper products and all the other stuff that comes with it.
Lower price goods. All of us want that, or we claim we do.
But, the trade-off, which I think we were unprepared for the magnitude of it, and we're only now really learning. There's a series of papers that have really tried to isolate the effects of exposure to trade from China by saying which specific industries were more likely to be offshored. and then going to the specific communities where those industries were concentrated and saying, well, what's happening to the workers in those places? And it's not good.
Not good.
It's just not good.
I mean, that's where a lot of
marriage rates are down.
Deaths of despair and all the other stuff we've talked about.
Worse job prospects, lower incomes, all that kind of stuff.
When you talk about trade and we think of the benefits of trade, I mean, we've been in this, what feels to many or what we're told by powers that be is a low inflation environment. Like, the cost of basic goods, a lot of the stuff in the consumer price index is stable. But some of the big drivers of family expenses, healthcare, education, housing, are the prices are going up. They're inflating at a much higher rate.
Yeah. So now we're moving from the income side to the consumption
and those
side.
are things you can't. Trade is not going to affect healthcare prices domestically. Not necessarily. I mean, that's a simplifying statement. But you're not going to outsource manufacturing in the same way that you're going to outsource healthcare.
You flip that, but yeah. So you're not going to outsource healthcare in the same way that you're going to outsource.
At least not. I mean, we're doing some of it. We're sending radiology elsewhere and whatnot. But generally,
it's much harder to outsource something in which somebody literally touching you is frequently part of the job.
Yeah,
part of the challenge. So, okay, we have the income side of things, and some people do well, some people don't. It's a kind of a mix, but part of that's because productivity growth has been low. Mm-hmm. That's part of why we don't see wages growing.
Which is, I think, an important point, because in spite of like all the technology change,
well, it's all related.
Yeah.
Right. The fact that wages are low is that why we actually aren't seeing technological change. We're seeing technological development.
Right.
Right. But we're not seeing. We have lots of new ideas and different ways of doing things. But we haven't seen fundamental shifts in how work is frequently done, in part because it's expensive to adopt new technology.
It is.
It's still cheap to hire workers. Getting a field if we're going down that far. But so there's the productivity piece, and then there's the rent piece. Mm-hmm. And a lot of, I think, what gives people anxiety in how we think about labor markets is, productivity isn't growing at the same rates, and that's part of it. But there used to be more rent in the system. Opening up trade and the technological development that we have implemented, they have made markets more competitive. And they have then taken some of the rent out. And then there's a different piece on top of that, which is, to the extent that there are rents, they are frequently being captured by not the industry, but by the big giant superstar firm.
Okay.
Right? And that big giant superstar firm pays its workers more.
Mm-hmm. It can afford to.
It can afford to.
And it's smart too, because it has that rent. It can share some of that rent just enough to keep that talent.
It's how it preserves its superstar status.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? It's like, okay, great. I have the money. I can go buy all the best talent.
I mean, and that comports with all the anecdotes you hear, right? I mean, we lived in Seattle. I had a ton of friends that worked at Amazon, and were they happy in their jobs? Yeah. Well, there's a distribution, of course, but many would say, well, I have these stock options, or I have this salary, and
I can't get it anywhere else.
Yeah, that I can't replicate elsewhere. So making it, there was high switching costs in a lot of ways.
And that's part of, and I haven't seen this linked explicitly, but I have a hypothesis that part of burnout issues, which I think we'll talk about at some of the future issues.
Yeah, that's next month.
Are part of, it's just the way the power has been distributed, right? Is the employer has this ability, because there's so few of them that are offering this premium, that now they get to play us again. It's just like competing with a worker in China, right? There's only a few jobs here. Well, great. Like, I have the power. I'll still give you more than you can get at other places.
Yes.
And you're going to suck it up and deal with the nightmarish schedule and the long weeks and the scarcity of effort that comes with that.
Because you're replaceable here or elsewhere.
Well, there's lots of talent, and lots of talent that wants to work here, and you can leave, and that's fine. But we have such, at the firm I used to work at in Portland, the guy who was kind of my helper, he got a job offer from Amazon. And he showed it to me. I was like, yeah, well, you should take that because there's absolutely no way that I can compete with that.
Not just in terms of the dollar salary, but also, the stock options and the stock package that comes with it too.
The stock options, the stock package, the fact that there's cachet and status, and all of it's there. But okay, so anyways, that's the wage side, and there's more to it than that.
Yeah.
But, let's move to consumption because
that's a big piece, and we talked about these different classes of expenses that are
what we got the benefit of trade.
Yeah.
Consumer products are cheap.
We got cheap plastic stuff,
right?
Tons of it.
Cheap electronic stuff, cheap plastic stuff.
Lots of iPhones.
Some cheaper food too. There's lots of stuff that we now get to enjoy more of, or at least have lower costs for. The problem is that those cost decreases have been balanced by the cost increases in the things that are really potentially the ones that we're coming full circle back to net worth.
Yeah.
They're big ticket stuff.
Sure. Your healthcare, your education.
And your housing. And, collectively those consume a giant share of a typical household's income. And it's actually interesting. Some survey somebody did at some point basically asked, well, what are you worried about?
Yeah.
Right. What is it that you worried about? And you basically could kind of, as you move up the income distribution, you basically move through these things. So if you're at the bottom, you worry about everything.
Yep.
I'm worried about everything. Right. After that, housing and healthcare become your big concerns. After that, it's education, and after that, it's retirement. Right. So basically, what you're worried on is it's a shortcut to where you are on the ladder of how well that you're doing.
Yeah.
If you're worried about everything, you're probably at the bottom.
Sure.
If you're worried about retirement, you're probably doing pretty well.
Probably doing okay.
Right. Everybody should be worried about retirement, but to the extent that you're, if you're sitting there saying, I'm worried about the fact that there could be this unexpected healthcare expense, and if that happens, I'm done. Retirement's something else.
It's like the economic riff on Maslow's hierarchy of needs or something like that.
Something like that.
And I'm thinking about this too, as we're talking about these categories of consumption, like a lot of education, healthcare, housing, these things all roll up into wealth in multiple ways. I mean, more education, more wealth, healthier, more wealth, less expenses associated with your health, all these things.
Yeah, no, I mean, they compound, right?
Yeah.
And it's why so much of what we talk about if we're not talking about jobs, we're talking about housing, healthcare, and education.
Meaning there is that sort of pithy quip of the rich stay healthy and the sick stay poor. And I mean, as we're laying this out there, I mean, that kind of comes to bear.
Yeah, because we have chosen it's not really a market, but it's a quasi-market to allocate healthcare. And scarcity is still scarcity, right? So when you're talking about whether or not we should use markets or not, you're really just deciding, well, scarcity is going to exist in any system. Scarcity doesn't go away. The question is what are the consequences of scarcity and who bears them, right? So when you use the price system to allocate scarcity, what you're saying is to people who are poor, you're the ones who end up outside.
Right.
If you move to a non-market system, well, now you're just allocating things through social connections and time, right? So you're basically just choosing, do I want to allocate things through money, social connections, or time? Long lines. And so, but then there are all the, I'm not saying that those are the definitive ways of doing it, but those are that's the trade-offs that you're trying to balance, right? And we have chosen to use price mechanisms in all three of those markets with attempts at subsidy to try and cushion, try and allow more access. The question is are we getting the subsidy level right?
So when you say attempts at subsidy, so some form of government intervention in healthcare or some forms of student loans or grants or stuff like that. We have mechanisms to try to shape the pricing mechanism.
Yeah, to shape the market. So in healthcare, at the low end, you have Medicaid. At the level above that, you have subsidies for the exchanges, as well as the tax preference for employer-provided health insurance. For education, you have just the state funding.
Sure.
And you have whatever federal funding is for subsidized student loans or grants or whatever it is. In housing, that's where we do probably the least. There are housing vouchers and affordable housing type stuff. But in terms of, the size of the program, the biggest thing that exists in housing is the mortgage interest deduction. And
you have to be in the game to get that.
You have to be in the game to get that. In fact, it probably works to raise the price of housing as opposed to decrease the price of housing. So, in all three of these areas, the question is, well, what do we want to do? So why are prices high? What's happening with both supply and demand and power? And can we do anything either by intervening in the market mechanism level or intervening kind of, I guess I'll call it aftermarket with the subsidy of some sort to mute it? And, those are the debates that we have constantly. That's what we're having because, these are what drive expenses. It's not exclusively, but what is it? It's like 17% of the average household's income, disposable income, goes to housing. Almost the exact same percentage now goes to healthcare. That used to be much lower. So healthcare has kind of been the thing that's really been creeping up. So those two things alone, and you're now almost to 40% of everything you buy. Toss education in, and you're
getting close to all of it.
You're getting close to half, and you still got to eat and all that kind of stuff. And so, so that's when we talk about material insecurity. The fact that these things, which you just pointed out, education, healthcare, and housing, are vital to security, right? So housing is a necessity, an actual necessity. Healthcare is certainly something close to a necessity at some level. Or at some level, it is a necessity. At other levels, it's pretty nice to have as an investment in your health and your ability to earn. And, as we talked about at the beginning, if you just look at the effects of age and education on security, right? So basically age, in some sense, is proxying for the skill acquisition that comes just over the course of your life, right? So that's why frequently you're more secure, your productivity is higher. And education also is a way of acquiring skills and productivity. And so, you kind of put all that together and it's, education, I need that too,
right?
If I really want to be secure, right? If you're over 60 and you have a college degree, it's like 90% are meeting all of those check boxes of security, right?
Yep.
So, it's very high. So that those are clear pathways to security. And the question is if you look at younger cohorts compared to older cohorts, and I don't have this in a time series, but in a snapshot, they're much more likely to say they're not going to college because of the cost. Whether it's just they're saying it's too expensive or they're saying the costs exceed the benefits in spite of the various evidence to the contrary, which, in spite of the wealth thing, if you ask people, was it worth it? Right.
They still say yes.
They almost all say yes.
Yeah.
Like 90% say yes. So we have these consumption issues as well that are certainly feeding into why people sometimes feel like they're at the margin.
Yeah, and do we know, just take those three categories, healthcare, housing, and education. Is the percentage of household income that's being allocated to those three categories on the rise?
Yes. All right, so I have the data for Montana. Actually, I have both U.S. and Montana. So healthcare in Montana is now 18% of what we call personal consumption expenditure.
Yeah.
Right, which is, the share of consumption on that divided by disposable income for the average Montana.
Sure.
That used to be 13%.
Yeah.
So it's been a 5 percentage point increase. The other way of looking at this, if you just look at the cost of what you pay, so assuming you have employer-sponsored insurance, the share of the premium that you pay plus your deductible as a share of median household income has doubled.
Yeah.
One
out of every 6 days you're working pays for your health care.
Exactly.
Right?
So housing in Montana, at least according to this data, and there's some issues with how they treat owner-occupied housing because it's hard because you have to impute some rent or whatever it is. And housing markets in Montana are weird for reasons I won't get into, but that's actually been pretty stable at about 16, 17%. It kind of fluctuates around. So I don't know exactly, and it probably varies a lot depending on whether you're a college-educated person or not.
Sure.
But but we know that education is more expensive. Even after you adjust for scholarships and grants, it's gone up a little bit. And if you don't qualify for that stuff, it's gone up a lot. So yeah, it's probably gone up as well.
And this is a dangerous question to sort of ask as we're getting toward the end of our time, but we haven't even talked about tax policy and how that layers on top of this. But that's part of this mix as well, right?
Yeah. So
it speaks to power and all of that.
Yeah. So we talk. And we're flipping back to. I mean, it operates on the consumption side, I guess, some as well, but mostly on the income side. So you have your raw income, right? So your wages, which are a function. And we also have hours. We didn't talk about that, right? There's also, can I get as many hours as I want, and how much variability in my hours is there? And those are other issues that affect material security in real ways. Like there's about a third of people have non-trivial month-to-month variation, and a half of that third say that variation affects their ability to pay their bills.
So variation in the amount of hours they work, and that variation can cause a lot of angst.
It causes a lot of angst, right? So, you go through, but, eventually you get to the government. And it's not just taxes, it's also transfers.
Sure.
Right? So we have taxes and transfers as ways of trying to help, so there's your raw income, but then there's just your disposable income,
right?
Which is what you get to keep after the government takes out its share. And then there's also the transfers that it provides in some form or another.
Sure, you could have some coming back. You could have some of your income supporting others.
And it's important, and I will be the wonky economist to say that doesn't just mean the checks the government writes. It's also the checks that you don't have to write for the government, right? We call those tax expenditures.
Yeah.
Right? And when I get to not pay taxes on the health insurance that the university provides me, or I don't pay taxes on the interest that I pay on my mortgage, that's essentially the government writing me a check. Right? Because it's basically saying, well, you don't have to pay me that. Somebody else who doesn't qualify for those things and is identical to me pays more in taxes than I do.
Right.
So, so it's both. It's both the transfer, the actual SNAP or Medicaid or something like that, but it's also what we call tax expenditures that, where people who pay taxes who don't have to pay as much because of something that the government has decided that they get a bonus for. So all of that stuff that leads to the income side, right? And then I guess we also should throw in family transfers.
That's true. Generational wealth and all the dimensions of that. And also I saw in some of the data you shared with me that an increasing number of sort of 20-somethings are being supported by their family than in the past.
Yeah. So
not completely, but to some degree they're getting monetary support.
Well, yeah. So it's like a third. If you have, it varies by education level, but if you're in the 20s, and even if you have a college degree, almost 20% are getting some form of family transfer.
Yeah.
If you don't have, if you're a less than high school 20-year-old, like 35% of them are getting some sort of family support.
Yeah.
And so, it ranges. And then I think it's like a different survey, like 12% of 20-somethings say they get more than $500 a month from their parents.
And that's not just a windfall for the younger generations. That is at the expense of what else that money could be doing for the older generation.
Yeah. I mean, so
could be being spent on health, could be being spent on savings in general, or whatever. Or it could be, the lack of having those funds could contribute to material insecurity in different generations.
Exactly, because it is, you are more likely to make those transfers if you are higher in the income distribution.
Right.
But it is not zero. In fact, it is high for everybody as you get older. It's like a third of kind of 50-year-olds are providing something to some non-household member. It could be up to parents or down to kids. It doesn't specify. I didn't do the data specifying it, but
right. And I guess I just want to be clear. Like we're not suggesting that the fact that more parents now are paying money to their kids at older ages, that we're not suggesting that's necessarily bad, right? I mean, there's all sorts of judgments that societies need to make about how families are structured and wealth is spread across families, but there are implications for material security over time.
Yeah. So, I mean, the reason we're bringing it up is because we're talking about your security. And security is a function of all forms of income. And to the extent that this is a piece of all forms of income, it's part of how we establish whether you're secure or not. I would say it's actually optimal to transfer money to, if you're a parent and you're going to transfer money to a kid, right? Doing it when they're 20 or 30 is much better than transferring it to them after you die when they're 70.
Yeah, absolutely.
From just a pure material security standpoint, we know that as you get older, you're going to find more security. It's just, on average, that's what happens.
Yeah.
Right? So to take and transfer to somebody who's 70 and already secure whatever bequest you're going to leave them, trust me, I would have rather gotten money when I was 25 than I will even now.
You can put it to work. Absolutely.
Particularly when your kids are little or when you're getting ready to buy that first house. There's a lot more from the kind of the marginal benefit to me from any money that a parent might transfer me. In expectation, it's higher when I'm younger than when I'm older.
Sure.
So, now to the extent that you're harming your own material security to do so, then that's an issue.
Right.
That suggests that we're just transferring insecurity around the system. And what we would love to do is lower the total amount of insecurity. And so if we're taking from somebody who's relatively secure and can afford it and transferring it to somebody who's much more likely to be insecure, that's fine. I don't think there's any reason to be opposed to that, other than kind of jealousy reasons.
Sure.
I don't get it and you do. And then the consequences of that, right? Which is, we know one of the consequences of family support, particularly for people with college degrees, is 20-somethings who get family support, if they don't live at home, do better in their occupation.
Really?
What's power?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I
get it. They have power. They have options.
I have options. I don't have to stick with this job.
Right. I can negotiate harder.
I can jump jobs. I can take a risk. I can do all that kind of stuff. So there's a fairness issue potentially with it. Mm-hmm. But from just a aggregate material insecurity issue, transfer away. You're basically, as long as you're reducing the total amount of insecurity in the system, that's fine.
Although, and we haven't really spoken about inequality, right? And how that's distributed across all these categories. I think probably we got to put a pin in that one.
Yeah, I mean, I intentionally did not dive too hard into that in the notes because it's kind of separate.
Yeah.
Right? I think what we're trying, that's a relative issue, and there's definitely a relative component to security, and that ripples through those mechanisms we're just talking about, right? But it's easier to have a conversation about material security at the absolute level, right?
Yeah.
Which is, do I have enough resources to satisfy my consumption needs to put me in a position where I am comfortable or okay? Because if I'm comfortable or okay, that's when the options open up, right? And if I'm in that quarter to a third who are frequently not at that margin, or even if you're in the okay group and you're kind of one adverse hit might knock you down, well, that's what we're trying to focus on. That's an absolute issue, right? That's at least it starts at an absolute level of how much income do you earn or do you gather from other sources? Why? How can we get you more? How can we lower the variance of it so that it's more optimally timed? And then what's happening on the consumption side, particularly to things that you don't have a lot of discretion over. Because one thing to basically be like, well, just don't buy as much discretionary stuff. You hear those articles all the time.
Yeah, exactly.
Don't buy your coffee, whatever. Why?
Right.
It's the
why are you spending $4 on a latte?
These kind of marginal things, which at the structure of what people spend money on.
Yeah, and they're objectionable too, just in a lot of other dimensions.
Yeah, but from a pure material security perspective, the issue with material security is the more discretionary income I have, the more secure I am, right? If I'm sitting there saying I can meet that need, 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 and I have stuff left over, right? Then I have security, right? Because that left over, that means I can save. That means I can build the nest egg, the rainy day fund, whatever it is. And, that stuff is driven by housing, healthcare, big durables like cars.
The big stuff.
In Montana, we spend a lot on those big durables.
Yeah.
Right? Because we all have toys. You know, the RV, the boat, the bike, the
snowmobile, all that stuff.
You know, in fact,
skis, bike,
As computed, the personal savings rate in Montana is basically negative. We don't save anything on average. And the reason for that, the gap, is consumer durables.
Is it really?
Yeah, it's recreation, which is recreation equipment, right?
Yeah.
And so, you know, it's us, Maine and Vermont, I think, are the lowest at the state level. It's not a pure, perfect personal savings rate, but it's basically zero.
Interesting.
And that's, you know, it's interesting because our income is low, but the average personal consumption expenditure in Montana is at the national average. We just spend it all away, and we spend it all away. And, you know, that's why people live here, right?
Yeah, spend it on your toys. Why not?
We got to have the toys to complement our outdoor recreation.
So I think that's kind of a good place to kind of land it, in the sense that all of these things, you know, roll up into, and I think this is why I enjoy speaking to you about this stuff, Bryce, the most, is because it's not just dollars, right? These roll up into the issues of well-being that we talked about before. How much time do you have? I mean, you defined this at the beginning, is do you have the resources to create options? And so what are those resources? Yeah, money is a part of it. Time is a part of that. Energy is a part of that. Power is a part of that. And all those things sort of swirl into this sense of well-being. Next month, we're going to talk about this notion of burnout that we alluded to today and its effects across generations. And we're going to be bringing back Anne Helen Peterson to talk about that. You might remember Anne from her appearance on the podcast in July. She's working on a book on burnout, particularly amongst millennials, and we're going to be kind of breaking down her more qualitative approach to the phenomenon with Bryce's more economic-based approach. So I'm excited about that conversation.
You know, it's exciting. We're having a guest on our little podcast.
I know. Incentives and instincts, bringing on guests. We're expanding the tent. Bryce, thanks as always, and I look forward to the next one.
Yeah, me too.
Okay, so that was fun. Coming up next week, we have Michelle Weaver-Knowles, who's launched a really interesting new business called Ava Health. She's a registered nurse and is doing a ton of interesting work with genetics, and I'm excited for you to hear that one next week. Thanks for listening to A New Angle. We really appreciate it. And we're coming to you from Studio 49, a gift from University of Montana alums Michelle and Lauren Hansen. And remember that A New Angle is supported by CED, Consolidated Electrical Distributors. These guys pretty much sell anything electrical you would ever need, but they also hire a ton of our students. If you want to learn more about jobs at CED, visit cedcareers.com. Before we go, I want to thank some important peeps: executive producer Stefan Borsum, and interns Aspen Runkle and Max Gibson. Huge thanks to VTO, Jeff Ament, and John Wicks for the tunes. And finally, props to Jeff Meese, our master of all things sound. Finally, if you have any questions, suggestions, comments, insults, whatever, please email me at anewangle@umontana.edu. Help us spread the word, and be sure to use the hashtag #anewangle when you do. Thanks a lot, and see you next time.